Hi, my name is Brian Apavu. I am a neurologist with an interest in philosophy, the mind, and living the examined life. Today, I want to dive into Eastern traditions and concepts that surround the idea of consciousness. I made a separate video on metaphysical and philosophical foundations of consciousness, which I'll keep in the show notes below, that largely focused on Western traditions. And to be comprehensive, I want to discuss Eastern traditions regarding consciousness as well. We can start our discussion with Hinduism. Within Hinduism, there are distinct schools of thought, or darsana, that look at consciousness in different lights. In Advaita Vedanta, consciousness, or Atman, is not seen as a byproduct of the brain or an emergent property. Instead, it is understood as the ultimate irreducible reality, identical with Brahman, the absolute ground truth of existence. According to this view, all experiences, perceptions, and mental activities are possible only because they are illuminated by consciousness itself. Consciousness is not something the self has, rather, self is consciousness. The Upanishadic phrase tat tiam asi, or thou art that, encapsulates this insight. The individual self, Atman, is fundamentally identical to the universal reality, Brahman. The apparent diversity of the world, objects, thoughts, sensations, even one's own body and mind, is understood as Maya, an illusion or misapprehension that veils the truth of oneness. This doesn't mean that the world doesn't exist at all, but that we misunderstand its nature. What we take to be solid, independent entities are actually transient appearances within the field of consciousness. Just as waves are inseparable from the ocean, but not the ocean in its totality, the phenomenal world is inseparable from Brahman, yet does not define it. Liberation or moksha comes from realizing this non dual truth, that behind the flux of experience lies the unchanging, luminous reality of consciousness itself. In the Samkhya system, one of the oldest schools of Indian philosophy and part of the Hindu tradition, reality is described as a duality between Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha is pure consciousness, timeless, changeless, the silent witness that observes but does not act. It has no attributes, desires, or activities. It is the seer, not what is seen. Prakriti, on the other hand, is nature or material reality. This includes not only the physical body and the external world, but also the mind, thoughts, emotions, and even subtle energies. Prakriti is dynamic and constantly in flux. It is driven by the interplay of three qualities or gunas: the sattva, which represents clarity and balance, the rajas, which represents activity and passion, and the tamas, which represents inertia and darkness. According to Samkhya, the fundamental error of human existence is the confusion of Purusha with Prakriti. We identify with our bodies, thoughts, and experiences, mistakenly believing that these changing processes define who we are. But in reality, consciousness, or the Purusha, is entirely distinct from material processes, Prakriti. Yoga philosophy, particularly as outlined in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, builds directly on this framework. The practices of yoga, concentration, meditation, ethical principles, breath regulation, etc., aim to still the fluctuations of the mind. When the turbulence of Prakriti is calmed, Purusha can be recognized in its pure, luminous nature. Liberation, or Kaivalya, is precisely the disentanglement of Purusha from Prakriti. It is the realization that one's true identity is not the body, the emotions, or the restless mind, but pure awareness itself. The liberation does not destroy the world of Prakriti, rather, it transforms one relationship to it, so that the self abides as the silent witness, untouched by the constant changes of matter and mind. In Buddhism, consciousness is understood in a different way from Hindu systems like Vedanta or Samkhya. At the heart of Buddhist thought is the doctrine of Anatta, or no self. While there is clearly experience and awareness, Buddhism denies the existence of a permanent, unchanging self behind it. Instead, what we call a person is a constantly shifting process, not a fixed entity. Consciousness arises moment by moment, dependent on causes and conditions, and just like everything else in its existence, it is impermanent, anicca, and is subject to suffering, dukkha, if clung to it. To analyze this, Buddhism describes existence in terms of the five sadhkas, or aggregates: form, the body; sensation, raw feelings of pleasure, pain, neutrality; perception, recognition, labeling; mental formations, thoughts, intentions, emotions; and consciousness, the basic awareness that arises with each sensory and mental contact. None of these aggregates constitute a self. They are like systems flowing together to give the illusion of a solid person. Liberation, nirvana, comes from realizing this illusion, loosening the attachment to the aggregates and thus ending suffering. One influential development in later Buddhism is the Yogacara, or mind-only school, which goes even further by arguing that the external world itself is not independent of consciousness, but is in some sense constructed by it. According to the Yogacara, what we perceive as an object, external world, is shaped entirely through consciousness and is seeds, the vasanyas, stored deep in storehouse consciousness. This doesn't mean that the world is unreal, but that our experience of it is inextricably filtered and structured by the mind. The Yogacara school thus presents an almost phenomenological account of reality. Consciousness doesn't just witness the world, it generates the conditions under which the world is experienced. In the Oriental concept of Daoism, consciousness is not treated as an isolated phenomena locked away in the brain, but rather as part of the larger flow of life and nature. A key concept is Zen, often translated as heart-mind. Unlike in Western traditions, where thinking and feeling are divided into separate faculties like memory and emotion, Zen integrates both. Cognition and affect are inseparable aspects of conscious life. To cultivate the heart mind is not just to sharpen thought, but to harmonize thought, feeling, and intuition so that they move fluidly together. A well-cultivated Zen is calm, balanced, and open, enabling a person to perceive the world without distortion and to act without forcing. Taoism frames this cultivation of consciousness in relation to the Tao, the ineffable way or underlying order of the universe. Consciousness in this perspective functions best not when it seeks to dominate or analyze nature, but when it aligns with the rhythms of the Tao. Practices such as meditation, breathing, and martial arts are aimed at bringing body, mind, and environment into synchrony. When consciousness flows harmoniously with the Tao, one experiences clarity, spontaneity, or ziran, and effortless action, wu wei. Rather than treating consciousness as a problem of metaphysics or neurobiology, Taoism emphasizes it as a lived quality, a capacity to be present, attuned, and responsive to the unfolding of life in its natural patterns. In Confucianism, consciousness is not treated as an isolated inner awareness, but rather as something deeply shaped by ethical cultivation and social relationships. The mind, Zen, often the same character as in Taoism, meaning heart-mind, is understood as inherently moral and potential, but easily clouded by selfish desires or disorder. Through education, ritual practice, and self-cultivation, the heart-mind can be refined so that consciousness becomes attuned to the principles of benevolence, or Ren, righteous, or Yi, and propriety. In this sense, consciousness is not simply an individual faculty of perception or thought, it is a moral awareness that develops in community and through engagement with cultural traditions. For Confucian thinkers, the ultimate purpose of consciousness is not metaphysical speculation, but harmonizing the self with society and the cosmos. A well-cultivated consciousness leads a person to act in ways that foster familial respect, social order, and political stability. Neo-Confucians such as Zhu Zi and Wang Yangming went further by proposing that the mind is directly linked to the underlying principle of the universe. For Wang in particular, the mind is principle, suggesting that when consciousness is clarified, it not only perceives the moral structure of the world, but it embodies it. Thus, in Confucianism, consciousness is achieved its highest form not in withdrawal from the world, but in becoming a vehicle for ethical action and harmonious living. In Zen Buddhism, consciousness is best approached not through philosophical analysis or theoretical frameworks, but through direct, non-conceptual experience. Zen inherits the Buddhist emphasis on impermanence and no self, but emphasizes stripping away discursive thought and intellectualization in order to encounter reality as it is. Words, doctrines, and conceptual categories are seen as useful pointers, but also as potential obstacles, since they divide and filter raw experience. This is similar to what we see with reification. Consciousness, in the Zen view, is not something to be defined, but something to be realized directly in the immediacy of the present moment. The central practice of Zazen, or sitting meditation, embodies this approach. In Zazen, one does not attempt to control or suppress thoughts, but simply observes them as they arise and pass, returning again and again to a posture of open awareness. Over time, this practice revealed that consciousness is not identical with its contents, the streams of thought, emotion, and sensory impressions, but is the spatial awareness in which they unfold. In the glimpses of insight or satori, practitioners may experience consciousness beyond thought, where the distinction between the subject and object, self and world, falls away. Zen thus frames consciousness not as an object to be studied or dissected, but as a living, dynamic field of presence that becomes evident when conceptual layers are set aside. When we step back and compare the Eastern and Western traditions of consciousness, the contrasts highlight not only different assumptions, but also different goals regarding this topic of consciousness. In the West, consciousness has often been approached through frameworks of duality, as in Descartes' separation of mind and body, or materialism, the view that consciousness is an emergent property of brain and body. Both perspectives tend to dissect, analyze, and reduce. By contrast, Eastern traditions emphasize non-dualism, as in Advaita, Vedanta, and Zen, where consciousness and world are not fundamentally separate. Impermanence, as in Buddhism, where consciousness is a conditioned and transient process rather than a permanent self. And embodied flow, as in Daoism, where consciousness harmonizes with the rhythms of nature rather than standing apart from it. These perspectives shift the question from what are the underlying properties from which consciousness emerges to how is consciousness lived and realized. This matters because it broadens the scope of the conversation. While Western science provides analytic rigor, explanatory models, and a focus on mechanisms, Eastern traditions remind us that consciousness is also something directly experienced and cultivated. Practices like meditation, yoga, and mindfulness are not just cultural artifacts, but practical tools for engaging consciousness beyond theory. And that is important because the greatest way by which we use knowledge and skills to help us is by allowing them to help us solve the problems we experience in life. By bringing these traditions into dialogue, we enrich the greater discussion of consciousness. Western frameworks help clarify, measure, and test, whereas Eastern traditions open space for wholeness, direct observation, and transformation. Taken together, they provide a comprehensive framework, one that honors the scientific quest to explain, as well as the experiential path to realize consciousness itself. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you do, please like this video and subscribe to my channel, and we'll talk again soon.